Alright, so we're going to learn about items. We're going to learn about how to make them and when to use them. Because this is going to be pretty extensive and there's a lot to know about items, I'm actually going to break this up into two parts. This part is going to be about creating items and all their different settings and configurations. And then the next video is going to be about actually using the items inside of shops and loot and chests and things like that. So just to kind of give you an idea of what you can do with items. So here I have a shop where if I open it, I can sell items to the shop and then I'll get money for it, and then I can buy things from the shop, like this book for example, and you can see it appears in my inventory. And then I have different loot objects where if you go up to them you can take the loot from them. It's kind of like a chest where you can just take loot from them, and then in this case when everything is looted the object disappears. You can also configure chests to have shops where you can't sell or buy from, you kind of just get everything inside of them. And this is pretty useful for creating custom logic where you randomize items in the chests. And so we're going to go over this all in part 2, but just to kind of give you a general idea of what you can do, you can equip items. So in my case I can equip this sword and it goes into this equipment slot. I can obviously remove it. I can also control what items I can equip. So for example, because I am the Blade Master class, I can't equip a bow. If I try to, it kind of doesn't work. I kind of remove it and add it back to the inventory so that it kind of gives the effect where I'm not actually using it. So yeah, you can do a lot of cool things with items. So let's go ahead into the combat preset and we're going to look at how to create items. So first off, you want to go here in this section. This is the item section. You can see I already have a bunch of items here. And you can see that I split it up into different tabs. These are all equipables, these are valuables, these are things that get automatically used, these are things that the player can use, and these are special items that just kind of exist in the inventory. Currently they don't do anything, but we're going to go over the different types of items. So let's start off with creating equipables. So equipables are things that the player can actually equip in their inventory. So for example, like a sword, it can be in their inventory and then the player can actually equip it. And then there are items that the player can use that just kind of sits in their inventory, and when you use them you can obviously call custom logic. You can write node graphs that will do things. So for example, with the health potion, if the player uses it, we can heal back their HP, whatever, like 1000 HP. So to add an item, you just click this new item button and you can choose what icon to give it. So let's just stick with the default one. We're going to name it something like apple. You can select what tab it belongs to and you can create new tabs here. In my case, it makes sense to make it a usable because apples are things you can eat, right? So we'll just keep it in usable. You can select the type of item, and there are two options here, normal item or equip. So if I choose equip, then that means it's an item that I can equip into my slots, like where I showed earlier with the bow and the sword. But if it's just something that's supposed to live in your inventory and not be equipped by the player, you just choose normal item. And then you can select the quality of the item. So this is kind of the rarity, right? We have gray, green, blue, purple, orange, where orange would usually be the highest rarity and gray is just like some basic item. So okay, let's go ahead and confirm the creation. You see that it gets added into my usable tab. It has the name Apple with its icon and it has a configuration ID. You reference items inside the node graphs using their configuration ID, not their name. So just make sure that if you ever wanted to reference Apple, you have to use this configuration ID. We have our basic settings, so let's go over them. The rarity is what we just selected and we can change it depending, if we want to make changes later. The stack limit, this is how many of the same item the player can hold. So in our case, it's a very large number, so most likely it won't ever exceed this. But if I didn't want these items to stack and I just wanted, for example, one item per inventory slot, I can set this to 1, or you could do whatever number you want. We have associated item node graph, which allows us to actually put a node graph onto this item, and then when this item is in our inventory or when we equip it, whatever it is, this item will attach this node graph to the character. And so just as an example here, we can see that we have two of these event nodes. If you just type in the word item, you'll see a lot of item related things, especially in the event nodes right here, item. When the item is added or lost from the inventory, when they're used, or when the quantity changes. So you can use these events specifically on the item node graphs to kind of trigger logic depending on what item you equip, or depending on if you use a certain item or if you gain a certain item. And so in this case, let's say when item is added to the inventory, I could just use this event in my node graph, and then whenever I collect an apple, I can check the item configuration ID, and if it's the apple's configuration ID, I can raise a counter on my one of the custom variables, for example. So there's a bunch of things you can do by setting custom node graphs onto the items themselves. For the inventory ownership tab, so every inventory on the player is broken up into different tabs. We have equipables, materials, consumables, and very special items. You can't change these. These are just kind of the default options that are inside of every player's inventory. So in our case, it's not really a material, it's a consumable. So I'm going to choose consumable so it appears in the right section inside of the player's inventory. For the description, this will show up when the player hovers over the item, or clicks on the item, I should say. So it doesn't really matter what we put. We can just say it's tasty or whatever, delicious, and it'll show up when the player clicks on it. And then we have the section for currency. It's asking us if this apple has a value, a currency value. And so this is a good time to go over currencies. If we click on add currency value, you see that I already have something called gold. If we go into this top left corner where all the menu options are, we can click on currency and inventory, and we can set up our currency here. So I already made this gold currency. I gave it this icon and I configured it with some options here. So let's go ahead and add a currency. You can see here, create currency was created when I clicked on this. We can give it any kind of name we want, like some kind of gem. And you can think about this like in the real game. There's Mora and then there are Primo gems. And there are two different kinds of currencies that the game uses. So obviously Mora is very useful for upgrading, and Primo gems is very useful as far as getting characters, and they're used for different things. Now again, each type of currency has its own configuration ID. You can give it an icon, and there's not that many options. It's pretty limited. You can't really make your own, so you're kind of just stuck with these options. For this setting, destruction debris, basically when the character or the owner of this currency, and this kind of applies to all the items, whenever the entity that owns this currency or this item is destroyed, you have options of what you want to do with these items, right? So do you want to be able to loot the item so other characters or entities are able to loot it? Do you want to destroy the item or the currency so basically it just disappears along with its owner? Or do you want to save it? Now, save only works for characters. So if a character has some kind of item or a currency in their inventory, it's going to save and it's going to stay with them even after they die, so that when they respawn, they can keep their currency or their item. But if the owner is a creation or an object, it's just going to get destroyed because it doesn't work the same way as with characters. So just keep that in mind. There's loot drop mechanics, so you can choose whether you want this reward to be shared between everyone playing. So there's only going to be one copy of whatever's been, destroyed and can be lootable. Or do you want it to be an individualized reward so that every player gets their own copy of this item, right? And so you can think about this in artifact domains. When you're in multiplayer, everyone gets a copy of their artifacts, or really any item in the world, right? Every item that's dropped is an individualized reward. So depending on your needs, you can choose different things here. And then as far as the loot appearance, so we're not going to get too deep into loot right now and configuring them, but you can choose if you have some kind of loot component, you can choose what kind of loot component you want to use to store these items when they drop, right? So you can think about when you kill an enemy, you usually get these little circle items that drop on the ground that you can pick up. So you can kind of think of it like that. You can configure what prefab you'll use to store that item when it's destroyed, okay? For display priority, you can actually get the hint here. The higher the number, the higher the display priority in the inventory. So if this item or currency appears in some kind of shop or loot component, it's going to, depending on the priority, it's going to be higher in the list. So it's going to come up first, right? So you might want to do this for things like weapons, just so that the weapons appear on top, or whatever it is. Or especially for currency, if it's something really important in your game, you might want to make this higher than other items display priorities. Okay, so that's pretty much all there is for the basic settings. Now we have interaction settings. We have an option to allow whether or not the item is destructible. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to do anything currently. It seems like this functionality is just not implemented in the engine currently, because the players have the ability to discard items from their inventory, and you would think that by disabling this they wouldn't be able to do so, but that doesn't seem to be the case. If you discard an item from the inventory, it just disappears. If you want to disallow players from removing items from their inventory or discarding them, you can use this event so that when an item is lost from the inventory, you can get the item config ID and just give it back to them. Then we have the tradable option, and so this works with shops. If you're interacting with a shop, you're able to sell it to the shop, and so if it's something that you can sell, you can keep this on. But if it's something you don't want the player to sell, you can obviously turn this off. So for example, if there is no currency value, which by the way, I kind of skipped over, but yeah, if you want to add a currency value, you just click it and then you can select how much it's worth. So let's just say it's like worth 50 gold. But if it didn't have any value, then there's no point in selling it to a shop. So you can obviously get rid of this tradable option. Next, you can select whether or not this item is usable. So if you click on the item in the inventory, there is a use button. And so in the node graph, you'll listen in for this event when items in the inventory are used. And then you can obviously do things depending on what the config ID is and stuff. You can allow the player to use multiple of the same item at once. And you can also make it so that when the item is picked up, it just gets used right away. So there are two cooldown options here. The first is just the regular cooldown for using the item. If you don't want any cooldown, obviously just set this to 0. But there's also an option for group cooldowns. And this is basically where if you use one item, you can make it so that other items also share the same kind of cooldown. And so you can kind of think about this when you revive a player in the real game. You can't revive the player with that food anymore, but you also can't revive the player with all the foods that allow the player to revive, right? There's like this collective cooldown on all the food items so that you can't revive the player using different kinds of foods, right? So that's what this timer controls. And you can add what kind of items you want to follow this group cooldown by selecting them here, just adding them. And let's say, for example, if I use the apple, then it means I can't use a health potion for like 10 seconds, let's just say, right? If that's a limitation you want to impose on your players, then this is where you would do it. Now, this is all for a regular item, but what about equipable items? So if I go and create a new item here, and let's just say I want to make a new sword, we'll just call it sword for simplicity, and we're going to select the type as equipable, right? Equip, and we're going to confirm it, and you can see that it's pretty much has the same type of basic settings, except for the fact that there's no stack limit. You can see that the option for stack limit is gone, but aside from that, it's pretty much the same. Obviously, since this is an equipable item, we want to make sure that it appears in the equip tab in the inventory. And as far as the associated node graph, you have two options for listening whether the equipment is equipped or unequipped. So you can make some kind of node graph with certain logic. Now, this kind of works a little bit differently because it doesn't return the configuration ID of the equipment that has been equipped or unequipped. It actually gives you an equipment index. And so I don't know why they did it this way, but basically when an equipment type item enters the player's inventory, it gets its own unique equipment index. And so you can use the equipment index to work with it instead of using the configuration ID. So I guess the reason, I suppose, is so that each equipable item gets its own unique identification. So even if you have two of the same swords, you can still kind of differentiate between which one the player equips. I know it's possible to equip the same item more than once in your equipable slots, so that's probably why they use this equipment index, because if you equip the same sword, and let's say you have two equipment slots, so let's say you equip the same exact sword item, but they're in two different slots, you're going to want to be able to differentiate between them. So you're going to have to kind of work that out yourself. But if you do want to get the config ID, there is actually a node for this that gets the equipment index and then spits out the config ID for that specific equipment. So you can still figure out what item you're working with, what the actual equipment is, by using this node. So all hope is not lost. Now in the interaction settings, you can still choose if it's destructible or tradable, but obviously since this is something that you equip, you can't really use the item because using it means that you use it and it disappears from your inventory. Whereas equipables just kind of, you can equip them, but they still stay in your inventory. You'll have to discard them if you want to remove them from the inventory. However, there is a different section here called Equip Settings, and this is something that we have to delve more deeper in. So it has here the equipment type. If you go into this little location icon here, it's going to open up this Manage Equipment Data section. And so you can actually specify affixes, tags, and types for your equipable items. So what are types really used for? If you go into the Currency and Inventory tab, you see that in our equipment slots, we can specify certain settings for each equipment slot. So in my case here, I have a current slot name called main weapon. Equipable types is of type weapon, right? I already made a weapon type. So if I just go here, you'll see that in my type, I made weapon as one of the types. And I can set it so that only weapons can be equipped in this slot. If I make a new equipment slot, then I can specify another name. So for example, secondary weapon. It looks like I can't even finish typing it because there's a character limit. So okay, let's not go with that. Let's say it's something like, I don't know, helmet. And so here I can click on equipable types and I can add a new type called armor. And now on my items, I can select this as a type. So if, let's say, for example, I created a helmet item, I can give it this type. And so when I want to equip it, it's going to get automatically placed into here. And if I have another equipment slot that's also of type armor, then the next piece of armor that I'm going to put on is going to go into this slot. So let's say I have like, you know, some kind of chest plate or boots, then it's going to go into this slot. And what's cool is that you can actually configure different rows. So this row can be for the weapons, this row can be for the armor, this row can be for, you know, whatever else you want to make. So it's really up to your creativity and what you want to do. So in my case here, I'm going to click here, please select the equipment type. I'm going to select weapon, and now when I equip this item, it's going to go into my weapon equipment slot. We can enable show type in details and show tag in details. So when I click on the item, it's going to show that it's a weapon, and it's going to also show all the tags associated with it. So what are tags? If we go and click on add tags, you'll see that I have a lot of options here because I made a lot of things. But if we open the equipment tag editor, we're in the same manage equipment data section. You see that I have a couple of tags here. And in my case, let's just focus on these three right here. So we have sword, bow, and spellbook, right? Now this item that we're working with is a sword. So I can create a tag called sword and apply it onto all of my sword items so that I can later filter through them in the node graph. I can actually get the tags inside of the node graph, and I can find all the sword items or all the bow items. Or in my case, I can choose rarity tags, and because you can't actually filter the rarity that you chose in the basic settings. So in my case, I made these orange item, purple item tags. And so when I want to query the item in the node graph, I can see if it's an orange item or if it's a bow. As an example, you can see that I have 4 different swords, and each of them have this in the reference list. You can see that each of these is labeled or is tagged with the sword label. Similarly, for all my bows and all my spellbooks, they all have this spellbook tag. So if the player equips an item, I can check what kind of item it is by going through all the tags. I can check, okay, is it a spellbook? Is it an orange item or whatever? And so you can kind of customize the logic so that if you want to do something generally for all kind of swords, so for example, if the player equips a sword, I can increase the player's attack. If the player equips a bow, I can increase their movement speed, right? So things like that. And finally, we're able to add affixes. So affixes are basically like, you can think of them as statuses, unit statuses, but for items when you equip them or when you add them to your inventory. So if we click on add affix, you can see again that I have a bunch of them that I already made. You can go into this open equipment affix editor, and again, we're back in here, manage equipment data. So as an example, we're going to go ahead and create one by adding an affix. We're going to give it a name of super speed, let's just say. And you can see that it has a configuration ID. And by the way, same thing with tags and types. They all have configuration IDs. And affixes can be applied to the character when they equip an item that has a certain affix on them. So for example, if I added this to my sword and I equip the sword, or let's say I obtain the item, depending on what option I choose here, effective when obtained or effective when equipped. So depending on when that happens, I can trigger certain things to happen. So we can see here affix type. We can select base attributes bonus, apply node graph, or apply unit status. So for base attributes bonus, this is just basically enhancing an attribute of the character, right? A base attribute. So as an example, let's select an attribute. And so you can see here that we have HP correction values, attack adjustments, defense, pyro res. So these are all basically like these physical stats that you can edit on the player. I can also apply a node graph so that whenever this affix gets added to the character, then whatever node graph I put in here is also going to be added to the character along with it, and it can start running some logic whenever the item is obtained or equipped. So for example, if I were to choose effective when equipped, then inside of our node graph I can use when equipment is equipped, because this is going to get called when I equip the item with that affix. So I'm going to equip this item, and it's going to call whatever node graph I pass in here, and then I can run my logic, right? But in my case, I want to just give myself some super speed, right? A speed buff. So I can go on to apply unit status, and in here, I can select which unit status I want to add. Now, there are some default options under status category 1, or I believe it's whatever you name it, but there are some default ones. And so actually the first one here, accelerate, is what I want. You can choose how many stacks you want to apply, or you can choose a bonus type, However, bonus types only apply for when you're using base attribute bonus. Okay, so it's literally in the name, just so you kind of don't get confused. When you give yourself an attribute bonus, you can specify what kind of bonus you want to give yourself, a fixed value or a random value. So for example, if I were to choose HP correction value, I can specify a fixed bonus value of, let's say, 100 HP, and then I'm going to gain 100 HP whenever I equip this item. But in my case, I just want to apply that accelerate unit status. And then you can also display text content. So this is actually going to show up on the item card itself. When you click on it, it's going to show you this text content. And so in my case, I can say something like gives a super speed boost, something like that. Now you'll see that the reference list is empty. So actually, if I go into my sword component and add the affix that we just made, and then make sure to save it so that it applies the changes, if we go back into this management tab, we'll see that when I click on super speed, it now shows that this sword is referencing this affix. Okay, so now whenever I equip this weapon, this item, it's going to apply a unit status to the character that's equipping it. It's going to give me that accelerate bonus, but the fixed bonus value is not going to apply because we're not applying an attribute bonus. We're doing a unit status. So actually these settings here are useless. Okay, so now that we learned how to create an item and all its different settings, let's go ahead into the player and go to the character, and we're going to make sure that you add an inventory component and an inventory slot component. So inventory is just for the player's inventory, but if you want the player to be able to equip items, you need to add the equipment slot component as well. It's not a part of the inventory, it's two separate components. If we click into the advanced editing, for the basic settings, it's going to ask you what inventory template you want to use. So if you click on the location icon again, you'll see in the currency and inventory management section, you can create your own inventory. There's going to be a default player inventory or something like that here already, and you can configure it. So in my case, how many inventory slots do I want? I can do 50 or I can make 10, it depends on your game, how much you want to limit it, or you can make it a really high number. I don't know what the limit is. It looks like 500 is the limit, so there you go. And if the character of the player dies and you want to spawn the loot on the ground or whatever, you can choose what to happen when the character dies. So in the destruction debris, you can click on loot. The loot drop mechanic, again, as before, you can choose shared or individualized. And then in the corresponding loot appearance, you can choose a loot prefab to spawn where the character dies. When you select the inventory that you want, then inside the game, the player will be able to open up the inventory. It's going to show up on their UI, at least on PC. I believe you just click on C and it opens up the player inventory. You can also specify the inventory contents when the player spawns. In my case, I just kind of chose some random items, but you can also keep this empty. And inside the node graph, if you just type in inventory, you can actually edit the inventory in many different ways. So if we go into items and inventory, you see that we can modify the inventory item quantity or currency quantity. So if we wanted to add an item, we would just select the inventory owner entity. So that would be the character. We can pass in what item we want to add to it or remove from it. So for example, if I wanted to add a sword, I would find the sword that we just made, copy its configuration ID, and inside here I'd pass it in. And then if I do a positive value like 10, it's going to add 10. But if I do something like negative 10, it's going to remove 10 of that item from the inventory. So it's really up to you how you want to manage the inventory. So I was just showing you a couple of options here. You can either start them off with some starter items, or you can start them off completely empty and then they'll have to collect their own items throughout the level. And then finally, in the equipment slot component, if you just click on the location icon, this is what we were talking about earlier. You can make new templates, you can make different templates, and then you can select which one you want to use. And so in this case, it's just this equipment slot template. I only have one equipment slot for the player. And so just to give you an example of what this all looks like in game, you can see in the top right corner, I have these two icons for equipment slot and inventory. If I click on the inventory, it'll open up just the inventory. But if I click on the equipment slot, it'll show the equipment slot with the inventory. However, if I open up my inventory with the keybind C, then it's going to open up the inventory and the equipment slots. And then you can see here, these are the different tabs. We have all, we have equip, we have materials, consumables, and very special items. Currently, I only have weapons or equipable items in my inventory, so that's all you're going to see. But you can see that we also have 50 item slots, which is quite a lot when we scroll down. But if I click on this bow called Artemis, you'll see that we show the tags, which is bow and orange item. you can see the affix, the attack bonus of 50%, and then the description that I set inside the basic settings, along with its value that I gave it, and you can see how many of these items that I own in the inventory. And so that wraps up part 1. We're going to focus on creating shops and loot items in the next part, so be sure to stay tuned for that. We're going to focus more on the node graphs in the next video, so it's going to be a little bit more complicated, but it's not that complicated. I mean, I already showed some basic examples in the node graphs so far, so you should be able to follow along.